I started my journey playing every Spyro game on April 20th. So after 200 days and finally collecting, beating, and 100%ing all 13 games, I wanted to go into detail in a series review to break down each game and my thoughts on it. Trying to 100% 13 games from the same franchise was tiring and sometimes I felt burnt out. Luckily, the Spyro series is such a good one that I was able to push through and enjoy each and every game. I'm going to be using this tier chart and placing the games based off what I gave them in my reviews. To start us off, we have the original Spyro in here. This game was introduced in 1998 and was pretty stellar considering this. This game was exclusive for the PS1, and this is the game that started it all for the Spyro franchise. The main enemy in this game was Nasty Nork, who turned all the dragons and crystals for talking bad on his name. You have to go around and save all the dragons in each homeworld. This was a pretty quick and easy game to 100%, but the animations were amazing, definitely considering the time of the release. I really enjoyed the simplicity of this game and how it gave you the ability to just go explore. In my review of this game, I gave this game an 8 out of 10, so I would have to throw this in B tier. The next game on my list is by far my favorite in the whole series, Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. This game was introduced in 1999 and it brought so much joy to us. This game was also an exclusive for the PS1. It gave us iconic characters in Hunter, Professor, Laura, and Mr. Moneybags, not to mention introduce us to the villains of the game, Ripto, Gulp, and Crush. In this game, Ripto has decided he's going to move in and take over the realms of Avalar. That is when the Professor decided he was going to create a portal to find a dragon to help protect them. Each individual level had its own personality and feel to it. Each time you loaded into a level, it usually gave you some kind of cutscene of something going on, and every time you beat a level, it usually gave you some kind of chaotic cutscene. It featured my favorite world of the series, Skilo's Badlands, and also had so many other banger places you could visit. The dialogue was amazing, the soundtrack was amazing, and overall storytelling was just phenomenal. My favorite game in this series and one of my favorite games of all time. In my review of this game, I gave it a 10 out of 10, so I have to throw this in S tier. The next game in our list is the final game in the original trilogy, Spyro Year of the Dragon. This game was also an exclusive to the PS1. This game was introduced in 2000 and brought out some crazy changes to the franchise. In this game, the setting is in the Year of the Dragon, all the dragon eggs were brought to the realm. The sorceress sends Bianca to go retrieve all the dragon eggs. Luckily, Zoe lets us know the situation. The sorceress is an interesting villain, and this has a good storyline following Bianca, realizing she is on the wrong side of this event. It had a ton of new additions to the character list and a good amount of returning characters as well. You had the opportunity to play as characters like Agent 9, Sergeant Bird, Bentley, and Sheila. This was also the first time you could play as Sparks, which was pretty cool. They also added a mechanic into the game where you could ride a skateboard in certain parts of the game, which was kind of an off-the-wall addition, but it was neat to see them try new things. They also did so good at making the gameplay so vibrant. One of the coolest games graphically in my opinion. In my review, I gave this game a 9 out of 10. If they didn't have the Yeti fights as a skill point, it could have easily been a 10 out of 10. This will make the game be our first entry in the A tier. The next game on our list is Spyro Season of Ice. This game was introduced in 2001 and was the first game outside the main trilogy. This game was made exclusively for the Game Boy and the first game outside of just the PS1. This game follows the same timeline of after defeating the sorceress, many of her henchmen are out of work, including a librarian of the name of Grindor. Bianca accidentally leaves her magic book at the library where Grindor snatched it and decided he wanted to become something strong. Unfortunately for him, he read the book upside down and transformed into something he did not like. The only antidote to this is 100 fairy wings. Throughout this game, you have to go and save the fairies. This game was sadly one of my least favorite games. It had no boundaries and you would easily die. If you did die, any progress you made on finding items would vanish as well. This is one of the more frustrating games as a whole for me, considering the potential this game had on the Game Boy. The storyline was decent overall, but considering the frustrations this game caused me, it did not balance out well. This game had me questioning even if I wanted to do YouTube anymore. This game did introduce different breaths to us though, so that was cool. In my review, I gave this game a 6.5 out of 10, and this lands it in D tier. The next game is the sequel to Spyro Season of Ice, and that is Spyro 2 Season of Flame. This game was introduced in 2002 and was also made exclusively for the Game Boy. In this title, Ripto returns and decides to steal all of the fireflies. Without the fireflies, they cannot breathe fire. This was the saving grace of the series at this particular point in time. Like I said, Season of Ice was so extremely frustrating, it had me second guessing even wanting to continue playing this series. They fixed everything wrong with the first game. They made boundaries harder to cross, saving you many lives. Also making it if you did die, your progression on items stayed the same, and overall it just felt like a ton of minor gameplay improvements. In my review, I gave this game an 8 out of 10, and this lands the game in B tier. We then turn back around and go back to the console world. We now have Spyro Enter the Dragonfly next. This game was introduced in 2002, was made for the PS2 and the very first game made for the GameCube. This game is also following the end of the Year of the Dragon, and it shows the whole gang celebrating defeating the sorceress with all the baby dragons getting their dragonflies. This is when Ripto appears and steals all the dragons' dragonflies, including Sparks. Going into this game, all I heard was negative remarks. The game was not as bad as advertised, but it was not one of my favorites. It did have a massive shift in minigames and challenges though, with iconic minigames like the Tiki drums making an introduction. This game did feel clunky and the movement was horrid, but it did give us our first time being able to use the bubble electricity and ice breath in a console game. It also started to feel like overkill having Ripto being the main enemy. He was one of my favorite characters in the game, but at times it just felt lazy having him there every other game. I just feel like this game had so much potential but never was able to live up to it. In my review, I gave this game a 7 out of 10, which has this game placed on C tier. We then return back to the Game Boy world for Spyro Attack of the Rhinox. This game was introduced in 2003 and was made exclusively for the Game Boy Advance. While the professor created a device to spy on Ripto to make sure he could do no wrong, they accidentally tore open a hole in the fabric of time and space. I thought this one was one of the more complete games in the series. In my opinion, each Game Boy game was made better than the previous one, and this one was a game which was made completely different from all the other games, and I thought they executed it flawlessly. It was a game that functioned with completing quests, and each land, when you completed a quest, it gave you an item for somewhere else that you needed to go take it to. So in order to beat the game, you had to get every item, so it made you run around the whole map and kept you interacting with different characters. It also allowed you to play as other playable characters like Sergeant Bird and Agent 9, though I did not enjoy their missions in this game. One of the more bizarre Spyro titles in my opinion, based on gameplay, but like I said earlier, I feel like they executed it flawlessly. In my review of this game, I gave it an 8.5 out of 10, which lands it in A tier. Next up in this series is Spyro Orange Cortex Conspiracy. This game was introduced to us in 2004, and this was the last exclusive Game Boy game. This was a crossover game with Crash Bandicoot and friends. In this game, Ripto and Dr. Cortex decides to join forces to eliminate their enemies. Now, I haven't played Crash Purple quite yet, but this one was probably the most disappointing games of the franchise. You had the opportunity to incorporate another beloved character in your game, and I felt like there was no effort at all in developing it. Each role just had the same missions that we've already completed with a different background. In order to 100% the game, you have to beat each minigame 3 times. This was making the game way too repetitive. I feel like if this game was ported to a different console, like the PS2 or GameCube, this could have been a generational game. Maybe in the future they can remaster and just port it somewhere else, but for the time being, in my review, I gave this game a 6 out of 10, and this lands in our first game in F tier. We then pivot back to the consoles and get Spyro A Hero's Tale. This game was introduced to us in 2004 and was such a stellar game. A Hero's Tale was released for PS2, GameCube, and was the first game available for the original Xbox. In this game, we are introduced to a new villain, a dragon named Red. Red even used his power to resurrect Nasty Gnorc, giving us a really fun cutscene when the two of them meet back up to battle. This was the sequel to Enter the Dragonfly, but thankfully in this one they made everything better. I feel like they listened to the responses of Enter the Dragonfly and just really tried to do better. The game was a tad glitchy at times, but overall amazing. It introduced a whole new set of enemies, one of which was actually a dragon. They did such a good job of building up Red's power. We also got introduced to a ton of new characters and even had the opportunity to play as a new character in Blink. This might not be as high on everyone's list, but I really love this game. In my review, I gave this game a 9.5 out of 10, which scores it S tier material. We then head back to the handheld world and get our first look of a game on the Nintendo DS. We were introduced to Spyro's Shadow Legacy in 2005, and this one was made exclusively for the Nintendo DS. Shadow Legacy had us saying bye to our friends while we stayed at Dragon Shores. While napping, everything went chaotic. In this game, you could travel through the normal world or the Shadow World. When traveling through the Shadow World, you would have to free your allies and fight many enemies. I thought this game was quite interesting. This was the first game that you could farm experience to level up and give yourself new moves and abilities. Never having a game on the DS, I was a little worried they were going to fumble it, but all the mechanics felt decently crispy for the most part. This game also had you running around doing quests for others, but it usually consisted of inside the villages you're in. The game was really glitchy though, and I had to restart twice just to be able to beat the game and 100% it. With that said, in my review, I gave this game a 7 out of 10, which could have been higher if it wasn't for how glitchy it was. This lands it at a spot in C tier. After Shadow Legacy, they forced Spyro into a soft reboot, creating a new trilogy of games following a whole new storyline. The first game in the series is The Legend of Spyro: A New Beginning, this game being introduced in 2006, and it was released for the PS2, GameCube, Xbox, DS, and Game Boy. This game followed a whole new storyline that follows the time period of the Year of the Dragon. We're all prepping for this time. However, there's a war against the Dark Master, and he sends his army in, forcing the dragons to send Spyro's egg down a river where he is raised by the dragonflies. This is quite unique compared to the other games in the series. It was much more combat driven and much more darker than the previous titles. You can perform some crazy combo moves and get more combat experience than any game in my opinion. Unfortunately, with as much combat as this game does offer, it does make the game feel repetitive and boring. Since every cutscene is basically you being ambushed by enemies, one of the more off-the-wall things about this game was that Sparks could actually talk now. He was actually voiced by David Spade in this particular game, which is so awesome. The ending of this game really saved it for me. In my review, I gave this game a 7.5 out of 10, which places the game on C tier. We then move into the second of the three, and we now have The Legend of Spyro Eternal Night. This game was introduced in 2007 and was released for the PS2, Wii, DS, and Game Boy Advance. In this game, we are met by the Chronicler, who shows us the ability to slow down time as well as unlocking our other breaths. It follows a timeline from A New Beginning. They improved this game vastly from the first game of the trilogy. There was less combat, more exploring, and just an overall better storyline. The fighting mechanics felt much more polished, and all of the different combinations you could create was fascinating. This game did such a good job of setting up the third game in my opinion. Not to mention the soundtrack throughout the whole game was stellar. Unfortunately, David Spade did not voice Sparks in this one, but it's still cool to see Sparks actually contribute to the storyline now. In my review of this game, I gave it a 9 out of 10. This places the game on A tier. We are now on the 13th and final game of the Spyro series. Like I said, it took me over 200 days to play all these, so this game might get some extra love to be one of the last ones wrapping everything up. The final game of the series is The Legend of Spyro: Dawn of the Dragon. This game was introduced in 2008 and was released for the PS3, PS2, Wii, Xbox 360, and DS. This game had us linked together with Cinder the whole time. This allowed us to play 2 players or switch in between Spyro and Cinder throughout the game, which was pretty cool. We also finally got to fight against Malefor, who has been the overarching villain throughout the whole series. I did think the movement and fighting mechanics took a major dip compared to the first 2 titles in the trilogy, though it did not lack in the storyline. This game also featured locations like Avalar, which is a really cool full circle moment, and also featured Hunter. It was a sad moment finishing this game and the series, but in my review I gave this game a 9 out of 10, and this places the game in A tier. I did not play the Skylanders game, and I did not want to place Reignited Trilogy in here since it's a remaster of the original 3 Spyro games. In the future I may do a review on both of them, but at the time I wanted to stick to the original Spyro titles. I did want to share some of my favorite characters in the series that did not pertain to Spyro and Sparks. Now for this one, it's going to be main characters. This might be a no-brainer, but you have to include Hunter in any list of favorite characters in this universe. He's the glue guy in the original games and even makes a strong appearance in the Legend of Spyro series. My second favorite character has to be Mr. Moneybags. I feel like without him the game would be too easy. Just kidding, but I do love a fellow who's all about his grind. My least favorite main characters has to be Agent 9. Throughout this whole series, his minigames just felt a little too repetitive for someone with that much potential. I feel like he could have gotten a spin-off series and had the opportunity to be a really fun character for his own title. My second character is also going to be Sergeant Bird. His minigames also started to feel really repetitive. There are times where they branched off from his typical missions, but usually they stayed the same and got pretty old. My favorite non-main character has to be the 2 kids from Ripto's Rage: Year of the Dragon. Handel and Greta were such badass characters for me. You never really got to know their motive, but if there was an opportunity to catch some smoke, you know they were always there. My least favorite non-main character is Mr. Moneybags Jr. He just kind of seems like he never had to work a day in his life, and he has never really been through any kind of hardship. I'd like to act like he's a good son, but I also feel like he backtalks a ton. Now, my favorite mission in this series, this has to be extremely random, but I love the Tiki Drums mission in Enter the Dragonfly. At this point in the series, everything felt like it was just going to be copy and pasted in each title, but it showed they were willing to experiment with different ideas. I absolutely adored this mission and loved playing it. My least favorite mission in the series has to be the Yeti fights in Year of the Dragon, especially if you're trying to get that skill point. There's not been a game to date that had a mission that frustrated me more than this, knock on wood. My overall thoughts about this series is it has to be one of the best in terms of producing 10 plus titles. For most part, each and every game seems to have a ton of effort put into creating them and keeping it fresh and fun. Playing 13 titles from the same franchise could cause burnout, but I feel like this series does a good job of preventing that. If I had to give it an overall rating, I would probably give the Spyro series a 9.5 out of 10. There were just a few blunders on games, and when they knew it was time for a soft reboot, they pulled the trigger to keep the audience engaged. My next series I'll be starting is Crash Bandicoot. Be sure to keep an eye out on that. If you haven't had the opportunity to check out my review on the Jack and Dexter series, be sure to check that out also. Thanks for watching and have a great day.